with that, there has still been a very strong capacity and willingness to repay debt obligations and an ability to adjust, as difficult as it may be, year to year, and depending on what the economic environment is, what the budget climate is, the state funding climate, the natural disaster climate. A whole range of issues are regularly facing governments, and the pattern has been that over time they will make the difficult decisions to eventually align their budget and also repay their debt obligations. So just as a backdrop, because I think some of that gets lost in some of the headline activity, especially in the last couple of years. Despite a lot of talk over the last year and a half of the expectation of widespread defaults for governments across the country, that really has not been the case. There certainly is situations of credit distress, situations of financial distress, but that does not necessarily mean that governments are defaulting on their debt obligations. Last year, for all of 2011, we had 3 rated issuers that actually defaulted on their debt in the Public Finance Department of S&P. And while we have seen an uptick this year, I think the defaults are up to 6. When you consider that it's, there's 90,000 units of government, we have probably about 17,000 ratings outstanding. It's not quite the picture that you might get in the headlines, and that's not to say that there's not stresses there, and there's not stresses that governments are going to face going forward, and we have definitely a view that the past does not always predict the future, but overall, even with a very severe recession and financial crisis and a lot of issues that were going on in the municipal world in terms of bond insurance and variable rate debt markets and other things and challenges, that the level of defaults has, the overall credit profile of governments has been relatively stable. So to just put a little context, I know that the topic of this conversation today is on property tax, and definitely some stress felt across the state as the governments adjust to that. I think one thing that I might say is that property tax caps are not necessarily anything new. Looking back to the first and probably most famous, the Prop 13 in California back in the 1970s, Massachusetts in the 1980s. Those are probably the 2 early entrance to the significant property tax reform, and I guess the good takeaway is that the governments are all still standing, still functioning. We have, still some very high ratings in California. We still have some very high ratings in Massachusetts. We also have situations where there's significant stress in both of those, and there's been varying degrees of state support when you look at California versus Massachusetts, and certainly that's been the case in New York over time. But even before property tax caps, you did have instances of very significant fiscal stress in New York. Back in the early 90s, probably the most significant level of deterioration with many governments in a fiscal stress situation. And again, New York on a spectrum compared to other states, did actively get involved in those situations and provide some oversight framework, begin to, introduce the concept of multi-year financial planning for those governments that were in distress. And those kinds of changes have certainly been helpful when you look at the, probably the most visible example of fiscal distress in New York City. Some of the changes that they went through during their crisis certainly have positioned New York City and provided a, they embraced a lot of those changes, and probably arguably one of the strongest managed cities in the U.S. today, with very detailed and comprehensive multi-year financial planning, debt planning, debt affordability, capital planning, things that really stemmed out of, were a result of the fiscal crisis. We did that commentary last year on the property tax cap. I will say that we haven't, there haven't been any downgrades directly tied to the fact that there is a cap in place. Certainly, there's going to be a level of planning and level of budget development that will surround that cap, that will create many challenges for local governments and school districts. I think that from a credit standpoint, what we're focused on is, to the extent, what has your historic pattern of property tax increase been versus the 2%? What other revenue options do you have? There is some revenue diversity in New York depending on the type of government. So what diversity you have or ability to affect change on other revenue sources. And then also, fixed costs relative to your budget. And I think that that is one thing for New York local governments. While the pensions may be, exempt from the cap, and those certainly have been a growing and significant source of cost pressure. The issue of other post-employment benefits in New York, I think, are going to be a significant challenge. Many states have moved to provide a framework to begin funding those long-term obligations, and New York has not really, there's not that mechanism in New York to begin to set aside resources in a trust for that. So long-term challenges related to that will certainly play into the expenditure. Some key elements of our financial management assessment about 6-7 years ago, we introduced this as part of our credit review process, basically looking at important elements, what we view from a credit standpoint, key issues for financial management that we felt like affected credit over time, and basically score every government that we have a rating on these particular issues, and revenue and expenditure assumptions. Certainly, to the extent that you're using property tax collection number that doesn't reflect reality, or sales tax estimates that don't reflect reality. Those things have very significant consequences for your year-end balance and ability to manage your budget during the year. Your ability to adjust your budget throughout the year is something that we have found to play a role in overall financial stability and therefore credit stability. Long-term financial planning, this is probably one area where we have seen significant focus for governments across the country, starting probably at the state level many years ago, and now even much more so at the local level, looking at the multi-year implications of what's going on with specific revenue measures, what's going on with various program initiatives that are being introduced, or labor contract provisions, and not just what their current year costs are, but what the multi-year costs. If you look over time at, had there been more multi-year financial planning around pension benefit enhancements, or if governments had the information about what a benefit increase here was going to cost 5 and 10 years down the road, different decisions could have likely been made. So I think that long-term financial planning is, where it's done has been a very insulating factor for financial stability. Long-term capital planning, again, just having a sense of, because we do view debt as a fixed cost of your budget. Hopefully, everyone who's issuing debt goes in with that in mind, but not just from a debt service standpoint, but you open a new facility, what are the operating costs associated with that? And so we get into those aspects of financial management. Investment management policies, and again, it's also looking at debt management policies. I think New York is in a very different place than other states where we see, you didn't see your average local government because of some of the restraints in place from a statutory standpoint, in a situation where they were in very risky derivative positions or had a very high proportion of variable rate debt. It's just not part of the debt structure for local governments in New York. And when you look at some of the, literally chaos that some of the governments had to deal with as the financial crisis hit, and had to reposition variable rate obligations, variable rate debt, New York, I think, was somewhat insulated there, and having a fixed cost structure for your debt, at least it's predictable. And then finally, and certainly not last in terms of importance, because I think when you look at a property tax cap and other constraints on local governments these days, reserve and liquidity policies, and we had an earlier discussion on what do we think is an ideal reserve policy, and we honestly, in this financial management assessment, we're more interested in hearing about what the individual government's policy is and what some of the background is to why they have that policy. Because a 5% reserve for one government is going to be more than sufficient if they're getting their revenues early on in the fiscal year and their expenditures are very predictable. It's not going to be enough for a government that has a highly volatile revenue stream and, you know, maybe doesn't get their revenues flowing in until midway through the fiscal year. The answer is going to be very different depending on what your revenue and expenditure mix is. And so we're more interested in knowing what your policy is and how you develop that.